Buy America stimulates the economy, creates good jobs, makes the industrial economy work.
Unfortunately, Buy American policies hurt America and hurt Americans.
Is it time for America to turn protectionist? Is the country risking a trade war? We'll bring you both sides of the issue on Bloomberg Television's presentation of this Intelligence Squared debate. I'm Peter Cook at Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. Will Buy American and Hire American policies backfire and do more harm than good to the U.S. economy and U.S. workers? That's the central question in the latest Intelligence Squared debate. Sponsored by the Rosencrantz Foundation, the debate series puts forward a controversial proposition, then invites experts on both sides of the issue to try and sway a live audience to their side. They vote at the beginning of the debate and at the end. Which argument will prevail? Can you be swayed at home? See for yourself as Bloomberg Television brings you this Intelligence Squared debate. Here's moderator John Donvan.
Speaking for the motion first, Douglas Irwin, a professor at Dartmouth College. Free Trade Under Fire is the title of his latest book, and those 4 words will tell us why he is here to argue for the motion that Buy American, Hire American policies will backfire. Douglas Irwin.
First of all, what is Buy American? Buy American is a provision in federal legislation that mandates the purchase of U.S.-made products in government contracts. Now, in some sense, who could be against Buy American? I want people to buy American products. I want a strong and healthy and vibrant American economy. I want good jobs at good wages for American workers. I think we can all agree on those propositions. But that's not the issue. The debate here tonight is about the means to that laudable end. Buy America may sound like it's a good idea, but the more you think about it, it's actually counterproductive. Let me give you a specific example of what Buy America is. In the economic stimulus bill that we talked about earlier, John Donovan mentioned, it was passed by Congress earlier this year. One section requires the use of American-made steel in all stimulus-related construction projects unless it costs more than 25% above foreign suppliers. Now, this is a good deal for the American steel industry, but it's a bad deal for the rest of us. By raising the cost of construction projects, our nation can afford fewer of those projects. That means fewer jobs will be created with the limited amount of money we have to spend. If we have to pay a 25% premium for steel, that leaves less money for all the other projects. And in fact, this is not a trivial matter. Picture in your mind for a moment the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. There's a lot of steel in that bridge. California had to repair the bridge a few years ago, and the Buy America provisions were in force. The domestic steel bid came in at, guess what? 23% above the foreign bid. The real problem is this. Buy America is a bad jobs creation program. Steel is very capital intensive. So when we increase production, we don't hire a lot of new workers. There are about 150,000 steel workers in the United States. There are 7 million construction workers. There are 1.5 million unemployed construction workers. Construction is really labor intensive. So if we spend more taxpayer money on steel, we can afford fewer projects, construction projects, that will employ more construction workers who really need the jobs. So why do we give U.S. steel producers a 25% handicap against foreign suppliers and other bidders? Well, they were the only industry that was powerful enough to get it into law. It's corporate welfare, pure and simple. I'm sure you've heard of the saying, what's good for GM is good for America. Well, we know that's not true. And what's good for the steel industry, its workers and its executives, is not good for America either, necessarily. Please vote affirmative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Douglas Irwin. And now to argue against the motion that Buy American, Hire American policies will backfire, Leo Gerard, who is the son of a miner from Canada, and now that he is international president of the United Steelworkers, when he steps up to that microphone, he has 850,000 union members standing behind him. Leo Gerard.
Thank you very much. I have to tell you that I've discarded a lot of my notes because I want to correct the previous speaker. The fact of the matter is that China did win the bid for the Bay Bridge, and the fact of the matter is that the Bay Bridge is now almost 8 months behind schedule, and that the steel that came from China won't hold the weld. And they're not sure if they're going to have to rip it all down and rebuild it. So that if we talk about what that represents in lost dollars and productivity, it's way more than the number that Doug used. Let me then go back to my notes. The fact of the matter is that 3 trillion tax dollars per year are spent by the federal government in federal procurement. And no one is saying that it's simply that you get the money that comes from tax dollars and you use it to buy Chinese goods. And the fact of the matter is this has gone through the roof since the passage of NAFTA and PNTR. And what we've done is we've lost, in our manufacturing base, from 1949 to 69, manufacturing was 28% of the economy of America. And we were the world's largest creditor nation. By the time we got to the end of last year, manufacturing was 9% of the economy, and we have now become the world's largest debtor nation. The fact of the matter is, if we don't start buying products that are made here, what we'll end up doing is borrowing Chinese money to import Chinese parts and have laid off workers. And the fact of the matter is that Buy America stimulates the economy, creates good jobs, makes the industrial economy work. And if the industrial economy works, then we need engineers, we need innovation, and we need the other pieces that make that economy hum. If we go back to the period from 1994 when we abandoned, in a much more aggressive way, industrial manufacturing in America, in that period of time, America's accumulated a $6.5 trillion trade debt. We've had 25 years in a row, exacerbated since 1994, of year after year after year record-breaking trade deficits. There can be an argument made that a large part of the economic collapse that we saw is because there was too much money in the wrong direction.
Leo Gerard, thank you very much. Our next debater is going to argue in the affirmative. He thinks that Buy American will backfire, not surprisingly, because he is one of the world's preeminent economists and has long argued that globalization is the world's most powerful force for social good. From Columbia University, Jagdish Bhagwati.
Thank you very much. The problem, I think, with Mr. Gerard is, I think, as Doug was pointing out, and with the opposing side, basically, is that you think that Buy America will create jobs in the steel-using sectors, for example, or in the steel industry. What does that do to the rest of the system? Because you are then opening up a whole series of additional effects which are actually going to overwhelm the initial primary impact. And that's essentially what we need to focus on. What are these additional effects? One, of course, is that downstream industries typically become more uncompetitive. We know when President Bush put on the steel tariffs in '92, the effect was, in fact, to price out a whole lot of steel-using industries, including autos, there is a famous study which shows that about 200,000 jobs may have been lost, while we gained a few basically through protecting steel. Even if we didn't have this problem, we would have the problem of retaliation. And I would say it's not tit-for-tat retaliation necessarily. It's also monkey-see, monkey-do kind of imitation. We do something, others do the same thing. If you look at the 1930s, it was exactly spreading and diffusion of all kinds of trade barriers, starting out from the Smoot-Hawley, etc. And this, I think, led to essentially what we in economics call a nuclear winter, basically. There was a chaotic outbreak of all kinds of trade barriers. That came home to roost, in turn, on our export performance, on everybody's export performance. You have basically, therefore, a lot of your jobs at stake. And those are going to outweigh the few jobs you may save through Buy America provisions. I think this is, if you look at Buy America, and if you know a little bit of history, I know just a little bit, Doug knows much more, but Buy America, when did it first get passed in this country? It has to be in this country, obviously it was Buy America. It was 1933, right after the Depression, the Great Crash. And that's what set the stage. And I think we are now reenacting that after this current crisis, so beware is all I say.
Jagdish Bhagwati, I'm sorry, your time is up.
So I will pick up the argument later.
The proposition we are debating here is Buy American, Hire American policies will backfire. We have 6 panelists, 3 against 3. And next to speak against the motion, Buy American, Hire American policies will backfire, John R. MacArthur, known as Rick. He is president and publisher of Harper's Magazine, the oldest continuously published monthly magazine in America, and also one of the most progressive. Ladies and gentlemen, Rick MacArthur.
Now, let's admit, on the protectionist side, that Buy American policies are indirect tariffs, indirect subsidies, whatever you want to call them. And there are many statistics to support the protectionist model. I don't pretend they're definitive any more than my economist friends can make the argument that their statistics or their studies are definitive, because they're not scientific experiments. But since we're talking about protectionism versus free trade, essentially, we can cite some spectacularly successful protectionist schemes. Mexico, poor, beleaguered, exploited Mexico in the 50s, 60s, and 70s had a program called import substitution, a nice way of saying, or a technical way of saying, buy Mexican. And Mexico enjoyed the highest growth rates in its history through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, of roughly, I think, averaging about 7%. Just to give you a more specific recent example, we still have a 25% tariff, import tariff on pickup trucks in the United States. That's why Toyota, until very recently, was still manufacturing pickups at their NUMMI joint operating plant in Fremont, California, in their joint operation with General Motors. That's what kept Toyota in the game, was the 25% tariff on imported pickups. It's probably not a coincidence that in 1945, the average U.S. tariff on dutiable imports was 28%. And in the same year, manufacturing employment, which, as you all know, pays better than working at Walmart, manufacturing employment as a percentage of total U.S. employment was 35%. It's also likely not a coincidence that in 2008, the average tariff on dutiable imports was 4%. By the way, these are Professor Irwin's numbers. And in the same year, manufacturing employment as a percentage of total U.S. employment was just under 10%. Now, again, these are anecdotal, this is anecdotal evidence. I don't pretend it's scientific, but in 1979, the year in which manufacturing employment peaked in the United States, the median weekly earnings for all U.S. workers in 2009 dollars were $716.47. In the second quarter of 2009, the median weekly earnings for U.S. workers were $734, just slightly above. So we can make the argument that a pro-free trade, lower tariff economy has possibly contributed to the stagnation of wages. I think we can say anecdotally that because manufacturing employment has declined and manufacturing jobs pay better than service jobs, generally speaking, this has contributed to the stagnation of wages.
Rick MacArthur, your time's up.
Okay. Thank you.
Our next debater, Susan Schwab, was to any of our international trading partners the face of U.S. trade, holding, as she did, the post of United States Trade Representative in the George W. Bush administration. That is a cabinet-level position. She saw firsthand government thinking on trade, and she also influenced it. And now at the University of Maryland, she is here to argue that Buy American, Hire American policies will backfire. Susan Schwab.
Buy American? Buy American sounds like motherhood and apple pie. And unfortunately, Buy American policies hurt America and hurt Americans. And we have history to point to, and we have the fact that the United States has to export to grow, to point to, and the fact that the risk of retaliation is very, very real indeed. No country has ever reached or sustained a level of prosperity with economic isolationism as their policy, with trade protectionism as their policy, with binational policies. In fact, if you look at the 1990s, the countries that grew the fastest in the 1990s were countries that opened their markets, followed our lead, by the way, opening our markets. They grew 3 times faster than the countries that did not open their markets. Retaliation is not some myth. Retaliation is very, very real. Not only did we see it after Smoot-Hawley, we saw it after the Buy America language. It is not coincidence that within 6 weeks of the Buy America legislation on the stimulus package moving through the United States Congress, it is not coincidence that the Chinese suddenly decided to let their provinces favor local companies. Because before that, a lot of Americans were starting to make a lot of money in those markets. We need access to those markets, and we need to be exporting to stay competitive. The folks who are telling us this isn't going to happen, they are ignoring the fact that the Canadians have already retaliated, the Chinese have already retaliated. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimates that for every 1% of this global stimulus bonanza that is out there that we lose because of retaliation, we lose 175,000 jobs. That eclipses the, 9,000 jobs that the Peterson Institute has told us could possibly be created in the steel industry in the United States. And Doug has already talked about how that has hurt other workers in construction and so on. So let me close as follows. One, remind you, there is zero evidence that binational policies create more jobs than they sacrifice. And in fact, the data is very, very compelling the other way. Trade isolationism kills jobs. It does not create jobs. Buy American sounds good. And the issues that are being raised by the other side in many ways are legitimate issues. But Buy American policies and trade isolationism will not solve any one of the problems that they are describing. Buy American sounds good, good soundbite, bad policy, hurts America, hurts American jobs. Thank you.
And finally, speaking against the motion, Buy American, Hire American policies will backfire, Jeff Madrick, a business journalist and visiting professor at the Cooper Union. In the mid-1990s, he predicted the end of affluence with a bestseller that went by that very name. His latest book, The Case for Big Government, the title alone tells you much about his political take on the world, as he argues now against the motion. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Madrick.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Enough is enough. A little tired of being told time and again that being worried about free trade is an oversimplified point of view. I'm a little tired of being given simplistic examples of where buying, say, steel in the U.S. will raise construction costs and therefore cost American jobs. I'm tired of being told that empirical studies invariably show that free trade has almost no effect on jobs in the U.S. And I better tell you the truth about that, because I have a whole bunch of things to say. I'm not going to get to them, and I'm going to forget some. The fact of the matter is, despite what Professor Bhagwati said, and despite his own studies, most studies find a direct negative impact from free trade on wages and on the creation of jobs. Number two, the fiscal policy becomes necessarily ineffective when 20 to 30 to 40% of every dollar we spend to pump up our economy in a recessionary emergency leaks overseas. We're not saying we should not have exports and imports. Nobody on my team thinks we shouldn't have export growth and even import growth. Nobody I know believes that. But we do want effective fiscal policy, and that's what we are talking about in the narrow sense. Will there be a trade war? Darn it, I am tired of these scare tactics. I'm tired of claiming there will be a repeat of the 1930s. Is China up in arms against this policy? I suspect China is now willing to talk a little bit because they see maybe President Obama is ever so slightly serious about imposing rights he was given in international treaties into which China agreed. Let's stop isolating this economic theory from the real world. China subsidizes all kinds of countries, push exports. We have to begin to realize that. We've got to think much more broadly about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff Madrick. And that concludes opening statements in this debate. Our motion is Buy American, Hire American Policies Will Backfire. We have 6 panelists, 3 arguing for the motion and 3 against. Now, before the debate, we polled our live audience here on where they stood on this debate, and I now have the results and will report them. And once again, the motion is Buy American, Hire American Policies Will Backfire. Before the debate, 57% of you agreed with the motion, 20% of you were against the motion, and 23% were undecided. We will poll you again at the end of the debate, and the side that has moved the most votes, that has changed the most minds, will be declared our winner.
As you just heard, before the debate began, a clear majority of the audience supported the proposition that Buy American, Hire American policies will backfire. Can any minds be changed? When we come back, sparks fly in the question and answer portion of the program. Bloomberg Television's presentation continues right after this break.
There are statutes for anti-dumping. There's statutes for countervailing duties. There are lots and lots of statutes.
To go on talking as if there is a free trade system in place that's being threatened is preposterous.
Welcome back to Bloomberg's broadcast of this Intelligence Squared debate. I'm Peter Cook. Before the break, 6 panelists made their opening statements for and against the motion that Buy American, Hire American policies will backfire. Now it's time for the freewheeling question and answer portion of the program. Here again, debate moderator John Donvan.
Now on to round 2. In round 2, the debaters speak directly to one another. They can question one another. They will also take questions from us, you and myself, and you in the audience will have the opportunity in just a few minutes. Doug Irwin of Dartmouth College, you are arguing for the motion that Buy American will backfire. You actually went as far as saying it has already backfired. I heard your opponent on the other side, Rick MacArthur, and his colleagues argue repeatedly that Buy American works and Buy Our Own Stuff works for lots of other countries who are doing it already. That's why they do it. Rick MacArthur cited Mexico. It has worked for Mexico. If it works for Mexico, why not make the argument that it works here as well?
Well, I wouldn't grant the premise that it worked for Mexico. In fact, what did that lead to? Huge debt crisis in 1982, huge collapse of the growing middle class, huge economic problems, which is one reason why they chose to embrace economic openness after the early 1980s. But actually, Jeff Madrick raised an important point, too. There's been tremendous economic growth in India, tremendous economic growth in China. The biggest change in the globe has been happening in those regions where there's hundreds of millions of people moving into the middle class. They're able to do that because of trade openness. And yes...
They're able to do that because it's a mercantilist policy, Doug.
Oh,
China... They're able to do that because they subsidize their markets. They're able to do that because they manipulate their currency.
I'm glad Leo Gerard of the Steelworkers Union jumped in, because one of the points that was raised by your opponents as you argue against this motion that Buy American will backfire, they raised the argument that steel products from abroad may be better and may be cheaper. And why should Americans have to pay more for their steel if they can get it better and cheaper abroad?
Well, first of all, it's certainly not better, and in some cases it is cheaper. But I come back to the point that Doug raised about the Bay Bridge. We have had red lead in steel that we've had to ship back because we banned red lead in America 30 years ago because of its health hazards.
That's an argument that you can buy junky stuff abroad.
Well, that's the argument, that we have a set of laws and rules, and we're a rules-based and trading system, but we're the only one right now playing by the rules. You know, and if we're a rules-based trading system, they ought to be playing by the rules too.
Let me hear for the side for the motion in response to that.
Well, there's nothing which prevents you from applying safety standards, and we are doing that all the time. So the fact that some Chinese imports or any other imports, including our exports, get caught in the safety net doesn't mean that Buy America is good. I mean, that's simply a non sequitur.
But
Yeah,
what
the
it
issue-
does
the-
is
I'm
what it does
sorry.
is it adds cost because we have rules, and then you come to us and say, well, your costs are higher. Well, we have rules.
Susan Choi.
Leo, and I would note, Doug never got a chance to finish what he was saying. But in terms of China, I have taken on Chinese trade practices, and we've got legislation to do that. We took 6 cases against the Chinese in the Bush administration. We won or settled every one of those cases, got rid of illegal Chinese subsidies. We managed to get the markets open where they were artificially closing them. There are statutes for anti-dumping. There's statutes for countervailing duties. There are lots and lots of statutes. Buy American legislation does not resolve any single one of the issues, excuse me,
Susan, the
that
problem
the
with
other
that
side's
is
been
dumping.
talking
Jeff
about.
Madrick from the other
Dumping
side.
goes on, subsidies go on. To say that we can handle these issues in the International Labor Organization or through agreements we make with China, disregarding the reality of the world, we're not even close to fighting a trade war. It's not even close. China needs us, we need them, but we've got to start dealing with the reality of what's happened to wages in America. And Doug, things have become extremely imbalanced in this world you're describing of China.
Let's let Doug Irwin in now.
Extremely imbalanced.
That's great. In fact,
Doug Irwin of Dartmouth College.
I'm actually one of the few, maybe trade economists, that believes the trade deficit has become a problem. So the question is, how do you deal with it? Buy America will not deal with it. It's not the right approach. 70% of U.S. GDP is consumption. 70%. What is the share of consumption in China? 30%. They are a high savings country. We are a low savings country. We are a high consumption country. They're a low consumption country. That is the ultimate source of the trade deficit. It's not unfair trade practices. It's not all this other stuff.
One way
we
to
have to save more as a country, and China has to consume more.
And Doug is also...
Jeff, let me bring in your colleague because we haven't heard from him
As
yet.
long as you give me a chance for a couple of
Rick
seconds.
McCarthy, come on in.
Well, when I have arguments with my friends on the in the economics departments of these various universities, I have to ask myself if they've ever met a factory worker. Have they ever talked to a steel worker or to an auto worker or to an electrical worker who's lost their job because the United States has been pursuing pro-buy foreign policies for the last 15 years. That's what we have right now with NAFTA and the permanent normal trade relations with China. To go on talking as if there is a free trade system in place that's being threatened is preposterous. It's more like a labor racketeering agreement. That is a conspiracy to fix the price of labor as low as possible, certainly to benefit certain shareholders and certain American corporations, but not to benefit American workers or to defend what we used to call the American way of life. If you want to keep driving wages down, yes, let's keep pursuing a non-buy American policy, and let's keep outsourcing.
So this critique seems to say to the side arguing for the motion that free trade, as you describe it, is a farce.
What Rick has been saying about trade agreements just isn't borne out by the facts. If you look at the agreements that we've negotiated, you find that U.S. exports to our trade agreement partners have gone up 40% faster.
They are
than
fake exports.
40%
Madam.
faster. Fake exports. Go talk to GE and Caterpillar
Jeff,
and
Susan,
UPS.
Susan,
Let me
Jeff-
finish
Point of
the
order.
thought.
You gotta
let me
really-
finish the
you
thought.
can't say this.
You can.
Well,
You
this is
had
not true.
It's utter nonsense.
I'll let you respond.
let me just
want in on
finish
this,
it.
too.
I can say it because it is a fact. And in fact, if you just look at the trade agreements that we negotiated during the Bush administration, U.S. exports have gone up 80% faster to those countries than the rest of the world. The 10 years after NAFTA passed, U.S. unemployment was lower, U.S. employment was higher, U.S. economic growth was higher after NAFTA. So all of these scare tactics, do not
All right.
reflect reality.
Your opponents are conferring, and they want to speak. I first want to get the process of questions from the audience, and I will come to you on that point. Right behind you.
I believe that America is a capitalist country, and capitalism rewards people who are more efficient and people who can give you more for less. So if these foreign countries can produce steel, like POSCO in Korea can produce steel better than U.S. Steel or Nucor can, then why are we going to reward mediocrity? Why are we going to reward the inefficiency of the American system when we should give incentives to the American companies to become as efficient as these foreign companies.
Let's give that question to Leo Gerard of the Steelworkers.
The problem with that question is it's living in facts that were probably from the 1970s and early 80s. And the fact is, by the time we got to the economic collapse of last year, American steel was the cheapest of any major industrial country, and American steel sold in America was cheaper than Chinese steel sold in China. And the reason for that is that China doesn't have sufficient raw material. But China went, think about this if we talk about a sort of a level playing field. From 2003, roughly late 2002, to 2007, China went from being able to produce 150 million tons of steel to 500 million tons of steel. That was done because they got subsidies, they got cheap money, they got free land, they got no enforcement, they got free transportation, they got export subsidies. When they exported stuff to us, they got the money back, and they generated that. And it's a mercantilist system. I'm not angry at China. I'm not angry at China. They decided to do that so they could grow their steel industry. We decided to punish our steel industry and reward those that take jobs offshore with giving them tax breaks.
Okay, the side for the motion wants to respond to that.
But we pay a lot of subsidies too, usually at the
Kawadi.
state and local level. They add up to huge amounts. People like Bloomberg even announced with great glee that we managed to attract industry, to New York, and all the governors compete for it also. So I think actually we don't have clean hands either.
We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back for more of the question and answer portion of this Intelligence Squared debate right here on Bloomberg Television. Welcome back to Bloomberg Television's presentation of this Intelligence Squared debate. It took place at NYU's Skirball Center for the Performing Arts. The motion for debate, Buy American, Hire American policies will backfire, and panelists are trying to sway an audience to their side. Let's return now to the question and answer portion, and moderator John Donvan.
Please stand up, sir.
As a Colombian manufacturer, I would be on the side of the protectionists 100%, because if not, we'll be run out of business. The fact is that one of the U.S. manufacturers, with 1% of its yearly production, would run us out of the whole market, of the whole Colombian market. So we think that it's dangerous for us, and we think that the policy of subsidies does exist in the United States of America, which it doesn't in Colombia, and as such, I should be a protectionist. I have no doubt that it's good for our country to sign a free trade agreement. So the question to Mrs. Trade Representative Schwab, is why, if I think you believe that what I'm stating is true, why has it not been signed?
The Colombia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement was signed over 2 years ago, close to 3 years ago now. It would benefit both countries. The Independent International Trade Commission has told us that U.S. exports would go up to Colombia, Colombia's exports would go up to the United States. In fact, because Colombia has preferential access to the U.S. market now, U.S. exports would go up to Colombia even faster than Colombia's exports to the United States, but Colombia would derive new foreign direct investment. We made all of these arguments on Capitol Hill, and a legislative process that has worked for the United States since 1974 was turned on its head when the Speaker of the House refused to allow a vote on the Colombia Free Trade Agreement when we knew the votes were there in the House and in the Senate to pass it.
In 2 sentences,
John,
what's the lesson related to our motion tonight?
Well,
Perhaps none.
Actually, there is. They're right. There isn't free trade in the world because Colombia has very high tariffs against our goods, and we allow them duty-free access to our market. So it's very much unfair, and the Colombia FTA would have evened that, leveled that playing field.
I can answer that question now. Sorry, now that I've thought about it. Our trading partners, Canada, Europe, are negotiating free trade agreements with Colombia so that they can have preferential access and lock our guys out.
Ma'am, your question, please.
We're at NYU at the moment, which happens to have a very modern law faculty with global faculty, global students. And I think they know something. America is a big, complex, influential place. It's the epicenter of financial crisis. It's in the middle of political and social change. And I think America needs the talents of the world. I was wondering if the opposition have admitted from the start that they're at most only half right in this debate, or will they defend a higher American policy?
The question is,
you're
not just talking about Buy American, but Hire
Yeah, I'm
American.
intrigued. You seem to think that that America, the implication of what you're saying is that the credit crisis was somehow caused by people who don't believe in market processes. The credit crisis was caused, I think most people believe, or at least in large part, was caused because of lack of government intervention and because of the inefficiencies and unfairness of unfettered free markets. The free trade policy. I'm not off the topic. That's what she just asked. I believe you're wrong, sir, and I'm going to continue. Okay? The point is that America is responsible for much of that credit crisis because it believed in free market theory. Now, free trade theory is a precise analogy to efficient market financial theory. It argues that all these markets in the world work very efficiently. If Korea makes something efficiently, why shouldn't we reward them? Well, their wages are very low, but are they making something? Are there more incentives? Should we have an incentive battle? So do we argue that trade is good? I think all three of us argue that trade is good. Do we argue that it's become unbalanced, that this is tipped over far too much, that the evidence of wages in America doing so poorly is clear? That's what I would.
Can I get back to the question?
Please do. Fair enough. Fair point.
Let me just say that I'm myself an immigrant, okay? I don't think I've done much harm to this country. But I do think that this country has done enormously well as a result of immigration. And I think to indulge in,
Listen, this is
hiring aliens last and firing them first, the sort of movements which are going on are extremely un-American and also extremely inefficient. We've really prospered on the...
Leo Gerard, and take that on.
I don't know where this argument came from. That I don't know anyone who's against immigration. What I am against is when Microsoft will want to bring in engineers from India that will work for $12,000 while they're laying off computer engineers that were getting paid $60,000. And want to use the visa system to do that. I don't think that that's right. Now, I'm all for, obviously, as you are, I'm all for the ability to come here and work within the system at the system that is, but don't use me to come in and drive down wages of computer engineers or anyone else.
Yeah,
that's the argument.
Let me just explain one thing. When Intel, Bill Gates, etc., go out and get people from, say, India, the vast majority of those people are fantastically able. They're trained at the best institutions in the country. So we're going out and looking for enormous talent.
Absolutely. We should pay them enormous
I'm
salaries.
a professor, as you know, and in every class there is a tail of about 30% who really should never have been admitted but somehow managed to get in. Everywhere. I've taught at MIT, I've taught at Columbia, everywhere it's the same. But I would just say one thing, which is that there are people who could be employed but who are kind of at the bottom end. They're not really comparable to the kinds of people we're going out and getting. And so I think the nation prospers by having those people come in, create jobs, because it's not a given number of jobs that we are talking about. And I think the other people will find their own way at jobs which are more appropriate to their qualifications.
I'll take another question from the gentleman who's standing with the microphone.
Let's stipulate that the effect of impeding lower-cost goods is higher prices for goods, tires, pickup trucks, et cetera. In fact, that is the purpose of protectionist policies on their face, is to prop up prices, in turn propping up wages. What is the, and this is for the three gentlemen on that side, what is the ethical justification for transferring money from the broad American population to workers in specific industries which is, again, unarguably the effect of impeding lower-cost imports.
The problem with your question is you don't get to the point that how did we so-called end up with lower cost? If we end up, instead of paying a living wage, we're paying less than a living wage, if we're giving cheap money and extra subsidy, if we're giving tax dollars to export credits when they export, if we're not enforcing safety standards, if we're not enforcing environmental standards, you could send me anywhere and give me those rules and I can develop the cheapest product. But what's the moral right? And in this case, what we've been doing, what we are doing today, is we're taking American dollars and we're sending them to, we spend a lot of time on China, but it could be India, or it could be Mexico, it could be somewhere else. We're taking those American dollars and we're sending them over there when they've cheated and haven't played by the rules in a rules-based trading system that the three of us are arguing for, and they're sending us back their products, and their products are knocking our workers out of work. There's a moral wrong being done there, but it's not by taxpayer dollars.
That is the same kind of argument that was used against labor unionization throughout American economic history. What is the ethical argument for raising wages above some supposed, and I would argue hypothetical, market rate of wages? The assumption behind your comment is that these markets work very well, reflect costs. The people without labor unions, to continue with that analogy, will always get what they're worth, and everybody will do well. That's just not, unfortunately, the way it works.
When we return, closing statements from the panelists and final votes from the audience. Stay with Bloomberg Television for the conclusion of this Intelligence Squared debate. Welcome back to Bloomberg Television's presentation of this Intelligence Squared debate. I'm Peter Cook. The panelists and members of the audience have been arguing over the motion that Buy American, Hire American policies will backfire. Now it's time for closing statements and the final audience vote. Here again, moderator John Donvan.
We're now in the home stretch, and in a very short time, you, the audience, will be deciding who has won this debate. But first, each speaker has a short summary statement. It's their last chance to change your minds. And speaking against our motion and summing up, Leo Gerard, International President of the United Steelworkers. Leo?
My point will be very brief, that during the period of time that we've adopted the philosophy that the other side is defending, during the period of time that we've entered into that blind drive to that kind of a trade and investment ideology in manufacturing, America has gone from being the world's largest creditor nation to the world's largest debtor nation. Wages of average Americans have stagnated and fallen. That the industrial strength of America has gone from being sapped at 28% at one time, now down to 9%. We've hollowed out our economy to the point now where you've got the Chinese will probably raise at the G20 whether or not we should move to another form of currency because the American dollar is not sustainable. I think that the way we do that is we develop a strategy that's going to rebuild the American industrial base, and we have to do that by focusing not just on subsidies, but innovation, creativity, and demanding that our trading partners level the playing field, and we're not going to be able to win against unfair trade, and we shouldn't pretend we can.
Gerard, your time is up. Thank you very much. Summarizing for the motion, Buy American, Hire American policies will backfire, here's Douglas Irwin, Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College.
Well, first of all, just in terms of the proposition before the House, I think they have backfired. I think that's demonstrable. I think you have no choice but to vote affirmative. But let me make some major concessions to the other side. I think what you're hearing is things we've heard in the 1980s. We've actually even heard them in the 1950s and beforehand. And that is that economic change is very hard and very painful. And we should do something to address that. I happen to think that the remedies they're suggesting are wrong, will backfire, and actually don't really address the underlying problem. We've talked about the declining share of workers in manufacturing. Manufacturing is a victim of its own success. A century ago, a third of the workforce in the United States was in agriculture. Now it's about 2%. Why? Because the productivity of the American farmer is absolutely astronomical. The same thing has happened with American factories. But there's no denying that trade destroys jobs in certain import competing industries, but creates jobs elsewhere. The question is the balance. Guess what? Technology destroys jobs. What's happened to all the bank tellers? What's happened to all the secretaries? Do we stop technology? No, we have to adjust to it and become a better society for it. I do believe the trade deficit is a problem, but it's not mercantilism of China or what have you. China is very poor, but their savings rate, what was the personal savings rate in the United States?
Douglas Irwin.
Zero.
Douglas Irwin, your time is up.
But they can save in China.
Thank you. Summarizing against the motion that Buy American, Hire American policies will backfire, John R. MacArthur, known as Rick MacArthur, president and publisher of Harper's Magazine.
Very quickly, even if you don't feel an ethical obligation to your fellow citizens or to the poor workers working for 30 cents an hour in China or $1.25 an hour in Mexico, even if you have no concern, ethical concern about them, I urge you to come over to our side, vote for our side out of enlightened self-interest. Because if we don't do something to compensate for these pro-cheap labor, pro-outsourcing policies we've been pursuing for the last 20 years particularly, but really since the war, we're going to end up with a political vacuum that will be filled not by a nice civilized businessman like Ross Perot, but by a very ugly right-wing populist. It's already brewing in the United States, and if you don't hurry up and do something about it, there won't be any discussion about free trade anymore. There's going to be only discussion about how to shut the doors to immigration and how to keep the labor unions from organizing immigrants, for example.
Thank you, John MacArthur. Summarizing for the motion in this Intelligence Squared debate, Jagdish Bhagwati, University Professor Economics and Law at Columbia University.
Let me first focus on Buy American provisions, because that's really what the motion is about. And there I would just simply say that while immediately you see that you're saving some jobs, you're losing many more because of the downstream effects, retaliation effects, diffusion of protectionism effects. By the time you've added it up, you're losing far more than you're gaining. And I think it is being penny-wise and pound-foolish. And we have to really rethink the whole issue of how we accommodate the institutional change to be able to support workers. But protectionism is not the answer.
Thank you very much. Summarizing his position against our motion, Jeff Madrick, Senior Fellow at the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis at the New School. Jeff Madrick.
Thank you. Free market theory is very compelling. And I think, judging by some of the questions, many of you believe it out there, that efficient markets exist. I'm a little surprised I hear so much out there, given the financial crisis, because we were told time and again that bonuses made sense, that securitization made sense, that even some people, like Alan Greenspan and to some degree Ben Bernanke, told us high house prices make sense. They resorted to the same kind of thinking that is behind this idea that we just let markets work and sort it out. The way to respond to change is through active government working with business, active incentives, and this kind of argument has diminished our ability to do that in America.
Thank you, Jeff Madrick. And finally, speaking for the motion, Buy American, Hire American policies will backfire. Here is Susan Schwab, former U.S. Trade Representative.
The fact that there have been 600 million people brought out of poverty in China and India, in part because they have opened their markets over the last 2 decades, I think is a very strong, positive note how important trade can be, and they're potential new customers of ours. We remain the single largest manufacturer in the world. We want to be selling those turbines, those earth movers, that transportation equipment, the aircraft. It's very, very important. And we care as much about U.S. jobs as the other side. However, not a single solitary one of the arguments that they have made would create a single job. The vote has to be on which side has convinced you that the policies will create more jobs and more opportunities for Americans. Clearly, that is a vote in the alternative, because Buy American policies have and have already failed.
Thank you, Susan Schwab. And that concludes the debating portion of our program. It is now time to learn who has won this debate. Our concluding numbers are these. When you came in and voted beforehand, 57% of you were for the motion, 20% of you were against, and 23% were undecided. After the debate, 72% are for, 14% against, 14% undecided. The side arguing for the motion wins. Congratulations to that team. Thank you from me, John Donvan, for Intelligence Squared US.
And that wraps up our presentation of this Intelligence Squared debate, sponsored by the Rosencrantz Foundation and moderated by John Donvan. The debate series continues this fall right here on Bloomberg Television. For now, I'm Peter Cook in New York. Thanks for watching.